So welcome everybody to the December Regain office hours. This session is a part of our Community Organizing for Agricultural Climate Change Resilience series. And we're excited to be hosting and be joined by multiple individuals and organizations who are doing important community organizing and work within their communities to mitigate and respond to climate change. I am Tracy Bulandi, and I'm a program associate with the Wallace Center. And we're hosting this office hours through Regain, which is the Regenerative Ag Idea Network. And for those of you who are not familiar with Regain, this is a member-driven community of practice for all regenerative ag educators, advocates, and practitioners in order to create collective knowledge and serve as a hub for regenerative ag education, advocacy, and collaboration. One of our offerings on Regain is the office hours, which we're offering once a month until February. And this office hours is a chance for all of us to connect and hear from individuals and organizations within our network who are doing work in regenerative ag. It's typically a presentation for about 20-30 minutes, and then a discussion where we open it up to questions and have the audience discuss with the speakers. So if you have interest, or if you know someone who might be interested in speaking on one of our office hours, please feel free to contact me, and I'll provide my information in the chat.
Yeah, I'm Erin Meier with Greenlands Blue Waters, and we work with partners across the Upper Mississippi River Basin on perennializing our working agricultural landscape with continuous living cover production strategies. As such, we see the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative, that's the last time I'll say that on this podcast, as an avenue really to meet and work with a variety of conservation and environmental partners, crossing beyond maybe those that are just focused on agriculture, but across the basin, meeting these partners and working on shared goals of water quality, soil health, functioning healthy ecosystems, and justice and equitable access in these kinds of collaborative initiatives. This is also an incredible opportunity to coordinate and bring additional federal funding resources to this kind of work. So I suggested we bring Trevor and the initiative to the Regain audience for all these reasons, and also to bolster support for the incredible work that Trevor and the Friends of the Mississippi River are doing with other key partners to really realize the vision of this initiative. So, and happily he said yes. So thank you again, Trevor, and I'll pass it over to him to take it away.
Well, thank you, Erin.
Yeah.
And can everyone hear me okay? Little mic check, we're good, okay. So thank you all for giving me the opportunity to present this concept called the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative. And for short, we're just gonna refer to this as MRRI, M-R-R-R-I. So we'll be using the phrase MRRI today. So I'm here to tell you all about MRRI, and then first, a quick reminder that of the many reasons that the Mississippi River is a national and global treasure worthy of dedicated funding and program support. So I want to get into that as well. But in terms of what we'll get into today, next slide, Erin, we're going to answer why we think it's time for MRRI, what it is, how it would work, how it would address some of our EJ concerns, who's involved, where you can get more information, and how your organization can get involved if you so choose. So hopefully those are the questions that I will have answered by the end of this presentation. So we can go ahead one slide and then one more slide, Erin. So just a little bit on why we care about this. I know this is not news to anyone on this call, but Mississippi River is culturally important. It's essential to our country's culture. It's long been a vital transportation corridor. Next slide. The Mississippi River also drives a vibrant economy, generates about $500 billion in annual revenue, and directly supports employment of more than 1.5 million people. Next slide. It's also a critical source of drinking water for 20 million Americans in 50 US cities. Next slide. And it is a pretty remarkable habitat. It's got a 30 million acre floodplain. That's a critical ecological lifeline flowing through the heart of our nation. It supports more than 780 species of wildlife. And is the migratory corridor or flyway for about 60% of all North American migratory birds. So in short, the Mississippi River is a big deal, but it is also at risk. You know, obviously there are severe water quality issues up and down the river that you're all familiar with. The river fails to meet water quality standards really anywhere from its length from the headwaters here in Minnesota all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Runoff has drastically reduced water quality. It's harmed aquatic life. This picture is especially important to us. Here we see the joining of the Mississippi River on your right with the Minnesota River on your left in St. Paul. And you'll notice that it's sort of, the Minnesota is brown and muddy and carrying a great deal of sediment and polluted runoff. And this is sort of the tale of two rivers where the sort of agricultural consequences to a lot of our, and water management consequences, a lot of our upstream decisions start to manifest themselves most clearly in our great river. Next slide. We also acknowledge that the impact of climate change is already impacting the river in numerous ways, making our communities more vulnerable to floods, hurricanes, other catastrophic weather events. And we note that scientists estimate climate change will drive a 24% increase in nitrate pollution in the upper Midwest Corn Belt region by the end of this century, absent really, significant interventions to mitigate those problems. So the interrelationship between climate change, sort of weather catastrophe, water quality, and drinking water are also clear. Next slide. Invasive aquatic species such as invasive silver carp shown here threaten ecosystems as well as fisheries and recreational industries that rely on the river. And then further downstream in Michelle's world, with its, next slide, Erin, marshes, swamps, barrier islands, the river's delta continues to lose ground through erosion, while the annual Gulf dead zone or hypoxic zone has pretty terrible consequences for our environment and economy. And so these are all issues that we think warrant significant, deliberate, concentrated national attention. And so that's why we think it's time for MRRI. Other treasured waterways in our nation have place-based federal programs to begin to reverse similar declines or challenges. And such geographically focused funding programs allow us to better coordinate existing federal and state efforts. They increase participation at all levels of government, states, tribes, local governments, NGOs, so we can better work together to address these challenges. Some examples are the Everglades, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound. All of these have dedicated federal funding programs, and we believe it's time for the Mississippi River to have its own, which we're calling the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative. Next slide. This all started with a conversation we had with our 4th District Congressional Representative here in St. Paul, Congresswoman Betty McCollum, who then served as the Interior Appropriations Chair. And she came to us and said, every time we get requests for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative or any of these geographic programs, people just love it. And they seem to be working. Why don't we have something for the Mississippi River? And we said, great question, we'll start working on it. So we reached out to some of our partners in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, National Parks Conservation Association, National Wildlife Federation, and said, what works with these geographic programs and how could we take the best of all of those worlds and create a Mississippi River initiative that might work? Next slide. So here's sort of what we've come up with. And as I'll go through this, I'll make it clear that these are still early days yet, and everything I'm about to say is totally subject to change within reason. So MRRI is a federal funding program, and our goal is to secure between $300 and $350 million per year for the river, which is in line with what the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has been receiving. Side note, GLRI also just got $1 billion with a B through the infrastructure program, but we're assuming that's a one-time thing, and the 300 to 350 is the appropriate number for the Mississippi River moving forward. To be eligible, river programs and projects would need to be in the watershed of the Mississippi River and its direct tributaries within the 10 main stem river states and tribal nations that border the river. So as is the case with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, MRRI is not regulatory, and that means MRRI would not create any new federal or state or local policies or regulations. It won't be used to enforce any existing rules or regulations. It is a strictly funding, non-regulatory initiative, and we've heard that's really important to our partners throughout the river. Next slide. MRRI would create a national river program office within the US EPA. The EPA would coordinate MRRI, but work closely with other federal agencies and state and local partners. And MRRI funds would support work in 4 main focus areas that I'll get into here, but it's restoring clean water, protecting and restoring river habitat, rebuilding natural infrastructure, and improving river delta health, and then reducing the impact of aquatic invasive species. Next slide. So I'll walk through these 4, and I'll focus a little bit more on water quality because it relates most to some of the agricultural work that I think is of interest to this group. So to improve water quality in the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, MRRI would fund actions that reduce polluted runoff, excess nutrients, and sediment. And there's sort of 2 main buckets of clean water related funding. And the first relates to urban runoff. So that would include projects that prevent urban stormwater pollution, or reduce what we call combined sewer overflow events, where raw sewage is discharged to surface waters through storm sewers during big rain events. The second bucket of MRRI work related to clean water is related to cropland runoff. So that would include investments in programs that promote soil health and help croplands retain water and filter out pollutants that would otherwise flow to surface waters and into the Mississippi River, and would also promote landscape scale vegetative cover. So this would include things like perennial grains, perennial woody crops, winter annual cover crops, perennial pasture, other approaches that help get to what Erin referred to earlier as this sort of continuous living cover, green growing vegetation on the landscape year round. Next slide. The second focus area for MRRI funding is about restoring river life. So MRRI will protect and restore wildlife habitat in and along the river by restoring the river's ecological functions and processes. And this includes programs that would restore riparian and floodplain wetlands, support in-stream habitat, including reconnecting side channels and backwaters, and support bluffland and upland habitat and living shorelines within the Mississippi River itself. So Eric, you were speaking earlier to your interest in this. Think of this as sort of bluff top to bluff top or floodplain to floodplain river corridor restoration. Next slide. To help reduce flood and storm risks and protect the Delta, MRRI would fund innovative natural infrastructure projects. So this includes investments that strategically restore the river's access to its floodplains. This could include modifying or removing levees or dams or culverts that impair natural river hydrology, protect floodplain lands through acquisition or voluntary easements, or even relocate, remove, or clean up flood-prone structures to restore floodplain access and minimize public costs. And then with a mind toward the Delta, it'll also help cover the cost of transporting responsibly sourced and clean dredge materials to better aid with river floodplain and river delta restoration. Next slide. And then finally, MRRI will address the impacts of aquatic invasive species by funding actions that control, manage, or eradicate non-native invasive aquatic species. So this could include research, deterrence, commercial harvesting of, say, invasive carp species, as well as other aquatic invasive species like zebra mussels, which are pictured here, that are known for harming water treatment systems, especially in the South. MRRI would also fund the reintroduction of native fish, mussels, and other aquatic species. So that's a little bit about sort of what the buckets of funding we envision for the initiative. And I want to talk next a little bit about kind of how all of this would come to be. So a natural question here is exactly which specific projects would MRRI fund? And the answer is that's up to all of us. The group, and I'll talk more about the collaborative that's come together to push for this, but we all believe that river projects are more effective when all river voices have a seat at the planning table. And that's why the first step for MRRI is to bring people together to shape the initiative through a 2-year-long EPA-led public process to develop what we're calling the MRRI action plan. And that's an action plan, let's say, would be about 5 years and then would be updated periodically every 5 years. And so when it's time for us to identify priority projects and build out this action plan, we'll be sure to reach out to all of you to encourage your participation. Next slide. We also want to support an evidence-based, science-based approach in all of our MRRI investments. And so a science plan will be incorporated into the action plan. And that's going to be developed through a new National Mississippi River Corridor Research Center housed within the USGS offices, paired with 3 additional research centers based out of host universities working with sort of the upper, middle, and lower reaches of the river. And so that science plan will also be developed over 2 years and incorporated into the action plan. And the idea here is to identify, what do we know? What are the gaps in our knowledge? Where do we need to invest to better enhance our understanding of how best to restore this river? And then how do we prioritize those investments and include them in the action plan, so that as MRRI funding is appropriated, we can sort of tick off those research boxes and needs over time to better optimize our river restoration work. Also wanted to take a moment to talk about sort of centering MRRI justice and equity in a lot of this work. So next slide, Erin. We as a group, and I could go on in detail, but I won't go into here, but I will just say we have an equity and justice sub-team that is a part of the MRRI development process. And in a minute, I'll say who that is and how they've been working on it. But there's sort of 4 pillars of work that they have embedded in that committee. So building understanding of the different needs throughout the river, establishing an equity fund, which is literally the collaborative itself, has the individual organizations have set aside resources that we have made available for underrepresented organizations to participate in the work of the MRRI Collaborative if they wouldn't otherwise be able to. We've been really intentional about trying to widen the circle and diversify the number of groups and interests that are engaged in this work. And we're really intentional about lifting up the voices of under-resourced organizations that might not otherwise share the platforms that some of our organizations have, to ensure that their voices are sort of co-equal in this process. Those aspirations are all great, but I'm sort of more of a hard numbers guy. And so we wanted to make sure that there's some specific components written into the legislation itself. And we've done that. So next slide, Erin. You know, the voices of those most impacted by environmental decisions are often excluded or are underrepresented. So the MRRI Act tries to ensure that doesn't happen by proposing that at least 25% of all MRRI funds are directed toward activities that primarily benefit economically disadvantaged urban and rural communities and communities of color. And then in addition to that 25%, 10% of MRRI funding is to be invested in communities with persistent poverty. So prioritizing investments in communities of color, low-income river communities is important to the Congresswoman, it's important to our collaborative, and we feel like this language sets a minimum floor that isn't ideal, but it is at least a baseline that we can be sure that funds are invested equitably throughout the river corridor itself. Next slide. So I've referred many times during this conversation to the MRRI Collaborative. So who are the groups that we're referring to? The collaborative itself consists of organizations from each of the 10 main stem river states, as well as other local and national organizations and partnerships. Next slide. FMR is one of the organizations that serves on the steering committee, along with American Rivers, Freshwater, Greenland's Blue Waters. Thank you, Erin. Healthy Gulf, the Lake Pepin Legacy Alliance, Lower Ninth Ward, National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, National Wildlife Federation, and the Mississippi River Network. And the Mississippi River Network itself is a collaborative of about 60 Mississippi River organizations from the 10 main stem river states as well. Next slide. The FMR also serves on our campaign team alongside the National Wildlife Federation and the Mississippi River Network. So our 3 organizations are sort of leading the day-to-day work to refine the language and secure passage of MRRI of the legislation. And I should also note that, next slide, we've got state lead organizations who serve as sort of the first point of contact for MRRI in each of the 10 main stem river states. And I won't read them off, but they are listed here in approximate order of where their state lands on the Mississippi River. And so if you were in one of those states, I know we've got some folks from Wisconsin, so Clean Wisconsin is sort of the point person there. Michelle, Healthy Gulf is the point person down in Louisiana. Tracy, we don't have a state lead in Virginia because you're not on the Mississippi River corridor. You know, that's Virginia's fault, really. But these are the sort of the organizations that you can turn to learn more about what MRRI is and help engage your group. So I want to talk a little bit about the next slide here, which is how close are we to making MRRI a reality? Where are we in this journey? So next slide. Congresswoman McCollum and her team introduced the MRRI Acts, which is HR 4202 this summer. We've got 8 co-sponsors now from 5 different states and DC. So that is Benny Thompson in Mississippi, Corey Bush in Missouri, Steve Cohen in Tennessee, John Yarmouth in Kentucky, John Cooper in Tennessee, Lauren Underwood in Illinois, Eleanor Norton, who's the DC representative, and Dean Phillips here in Minnesota, as well as Congresswoman McCollum. And a Senate version of the bill is expected quite soon. I have a meeting to finalize language over there with them right after this meeting. And so we're working with lawmakers in both chambers to secure sort of bipartisan support for this bill. We hope this will move forward through geographic funding programs in the Senate early in 2022. That would need to be married with the geographics program bill that's already been passed out of the House, but oftentimes those are passed on sort of a consent agenda and usually don't have a whole lot of opposition to them, in part because of the history of bipartisan support for all of the other geographic initiatives I had mentioned earlier. So that is the most likely pathway for MRRI to get passed in 2022. Once passed, the EPA and its sister agencies would work collaboratively with states, local governments, tribes, environmental NGOs, other river stakeholders to develop a comprehensive action plan. And the USGS in parallel would be working on its science plan. And so the point there is that even after MRRI becomes law or is authorized, we have work to do each year to make sure that it is that appropriations are made to MRRI, and we'll have a couple of years of pretty steady work to maximize, river restoration opportunities through both the action plan and the science plan. And then next slide. So lots of information I've thrown at you here. There are ways to learn much more about MRRI. I'll include links, and we'll share this presentation with Tracy, and she can share it with all of you afterwards. But we've got links to where you can learn a little bit more about MRRI itself, as well as review the actual draft legislation. We are asking folks to endorse MRRI if this sounds like something you'd like to support, even if your organization isn't in the main stem, Mississippi River states. Please take a moment to endorse MRRI. If you've got mayors in your states, especially main stem river states, that you feel like would be supportive of this idea, we're asking mayors from up and down the river to endorse MRRI. We've got a listserv in which we communicate all of our activities to anyone who's interested, and you can sign up to be a part of MRRI listserv just by emailing me, and I'll sign you up directly. And then you can share with your members our action alert, which is asking our House and Senate members to please support legislation that will help make MRRI a reality. So next slide. Hopefully I answered why MRRI is important, what it is, who is involved, where you can find more information, how MRRI would embed justice and equity attributes in its language, and how you can get more involved. So with that last slide, thank you all so much. I know this is just the beginning of a longer conversation we'll be having over the next few years about restoring our great river. And with that, I think I'll kick it back to Erin and Tracy and see if we've got any questions.
Yes, thank you, Trevor. That was really informative. As you were speaking about that there is almost like a 2 approach, like urban and rural. And I'm wondering how what organizations are representative of those maybe 2 different points of view, different opinions together. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. So sort of within both the urban and the agricultural runoff, I guess there's a couple different ways to answer that question. First would be, who are the organizations that are engaged in the collaborative itself that are helping sort of shape the legislative language? And then who are we working with to try to sort of socialize this idea, get support and feedback? Because no bill language ever survives its first committee intact. Things are always changed and modified as we work through the process. So within the collaborative, our state lead organizations are charged with reaching out to the appropriate stakeholders within their state. So I am the Minnesota state lead. So I'll just give you my 2 cents. We've talked with we have a unique set of watershed governance entities here in Minnesota. So we've spoken with our state agencies, our watershed governance entities, which include a number of urban stormwater related folks, Minnesota City Stormwater Coalition, League of Cities, which has endorsed MRRI, Association of Counties, which has endorsed MRRI, to try to get their sense of is this the right loose definition of what family of activities could be funded through MRRI. And so we're pretty confident there. On the agricultural side, the folks that I've spoken with are from the University of Minnesota's Forever Green initiative. So they work closely with Erin and myself and others around continuous living cover cropping systems. Spoken with some ag groups like the Land Stewardship Project or Minnesota Farmers Union. And we're in the process of trying to get some more feedback from folks like the Minnesota Corn Growers Association or Farm Bureau. I would say that results may vary. Different states have different political relationships between the agriculture and environment sectors. We're more closely aligned here in Minnesota. I think there's some other states where we haven't been as successful getting feedback from some of our ag folks. And so I realize that may not be the most complete answer, but our goal here is to keep the language in the MRRI Act vague enough that we're limiting it to things that we think are appropriate investments for the river without trying to be too prescriptive and specific up front, because we acknowledge that we just need to get MRRI authorized, and then the real work of reaching out and getting input from much better informed local stakeholders is through that 2-year action plan process, which is why we wanted that to be 2 years, not like a 90-day thing. And that's a lesson that we learned early on from our friends in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is you cannot write a piece of legislation that covers that broad a geographic footprint and expect to know the right way to optimize it. So keep it vague and try to answer this question much better in person during an action plan process.
Trevor, you might have said this and I missed it, but how did you decide to take a mainstream approach rather than a basin approach?
Yeah, great question, Laura. So 10 states versus 12 states versus 32 states was a hot topic of conversation early on in this process. And I'll answer it a couple different ways. First, if we do the full basin, that's what 40% of the landmass of the United States. That's stretching the meaning of a geographic program and would be so huge that MRRI itself would need to be funded at a somewhat astronomical level to really be able to make an input on, or to change water quality, aquatic life, aquatic invasive species, and natural infrastructure into that whole basin. That would be really difficult. So we thought we should narrow it down close enough that we can tailor our funding to something that we might be able to show some positive impact over time. And so 10 states just seemed to be a much more manageable approach. There was conversation about making it 12, to include a portion of the Ohio River basin. There are 12 nutrient reduction strategies related to the Gulf hypoxia task force work rather than 10. And so that was part of the discussion, but we just felt like it would be, because we're talking a lot about river corridor habitat and aquatic invasive species that are much more narrowly tailored to the river itself. The collaborative just felt it'd be easier to start with 10 states. And you know what, if this works so well that we feel like we should add other states to it in future years, count me in.
Makes sense, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to ask questions I should probably know as the steering committee, but I'll say Greenland's Blue Waters has been as active as we can be, but you saw the partners that are really driving this. In the other initiatives that, we're kind of using as a template, or at least, advocacy argument, has there been any kind of return on investment metrics or, anything to easily grab to say here, not only are these the impacts of the number of programs, under this funding umbrella, but by organizing and coordinating in this geographic way, we've gotten this kind of outcome. Is there any either metrics or qualitative response to that
Erin,
from the other ones?
That's a really good question, and I should have these numbers top of mind, and I don't, so my apologies. But I do know I'll start with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And just to be clear, I work with Friends of the Mississippi River. I work on the Mississippi River. I cannot pretend to be an expert on how the Puget Sound program works. But within the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, because they were able to prioritize, as we are doing with habitat areas of concern in this bill, they prioritize sort of toxics areas of concern. And let me circle back to that initiative next, because there's a portion that isn't in this presentation that I should have shared. They've been able to prioritize what those sort of pollution hotspots are, just from sort of legacy industrial practices on in and around the Great Lakes, and they've been able to largely tick off most of those restoration projects. So Erin, one example for us, one of the last ones in Minnesota is the St. Louis River area of concern, where we've got sort of toxic metal mining upstream of the St. Louis River, dumping into Lake Superior. Huge sources of funding have gone to restore that river and remediate that metals contamination issue. And so they've been able to show, over time, they've been able to make really significant progress in removing many of those issues. The Great Lakes are also massive. And so to be able to say in a 10-year timeline, we've fully cleaned up the Mississippi River or the Great Lakes, no, like the response time takes a lot longer in water restoration, as I'm sure we're all familiar with, sort of inputs and outcomes. There's a delay. And so it's like planting a tree. It's not a full mature tree next year. It's a full mature tree in 25 or 30 years. So up front, a lot of this is more sort of assessing what the inputs are in projects that you're ticking off. But say in the St. Louis River area of concern, if we are reducing the amount of mercury or toxic metals that we're adding to Lake Superior, we can measure that reduction. It's going to take several generations of aquatic life before those toxins in fish tissue, for example, start to show a meaningful reduction. Similarly, in the Everglades and Chesapeake Bay. So up front, sure, have we seen about a 50% increase in cover crops in the state of Maryland because of the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Initiative? Yes. Has that resulted in a 50% reduction in phosphorus in Chesapeake Bay? Absolutely not. There's legacy phosphorus in that system, and there's a bunch of other states that are also contributing to the problem. And so these geographic initiatives don't solve problems immediately, but they do marshal resources and prioritization to start addressing the most potent problems first. And we think that in 10 or 15 years, we'd be able to point and say, here's how the hydrology, aquatic invasive species, aquatic habitat, and water quality of the river are healthier now than they would have been without this program. And there's also some decent, for every $1 invested, you get a $7 return. And I don't have that exact figure for GLRI, so don't quote me on that. But they've done a lot of economic studies in terms of return on investment just on straight initial capital, and it's pretty positive.
Okay, no, that's impressive. And I guess associated with that, I mean, a 300 and change, the 300 million is really that's about new funding, correct? But the other thing to highlight is that, as you just said, it's about marshaling and coordinating existing programs in a way that, that we as a set of collaborators are zooming out to prioritize that work. And that by doing that, we're more effective in the big, under the big umbrella of this kind of work for the Mississippi River. I mean, is that a correct statement?
Exactly. And I'll give a couple examples here. First, it probably doesn't make sense to try to go state by state to prevent invasive carp infestations in the Mississippi River. Minnesota is looking at Lock and Dam 2. We've got the Ford Dam, we got the Upper St. Anthony Lock and Dam as places where we think we could install meaningful permanent carp barriers or at least mitigate their infestation. That's great, but all of those are upstream of every other state and the Mississippi River and St. Croix River basins. And so if we act independently, we're not really helping the Mississippi River, we're just helping the upper portion of the river in our state. So it makes sense to pool resources and prioritize, say, carp infestation deterrence in places along the river that make the most sense rather than have 10 states operating in isolation. We could also look at things like, urban stormwater runoff. I am blessed to live in Minneapolis. There's our background where we've got fully separated sanitary and storm sewers. So when we have major rain events in the Twin Cities, we don't get combined sewer overflows where we're discharging raw sewage to the river. We've been lucky enough to be able to make those investments over time and have really excellent water infrastructure. The city of St. Louis does not have that. They have regular storm sewer overflows and major rain events. I did not know that. I was under the impression foolishly that most major American cities along the river had fully separated their systems. They haven't. Does it make sense for us to put a stormwater pond, I don't know, over here on Nicollet Island? Or would it make sense to spend that money instead separating sanitary and storm sewer infrastructure in New Orleans, in St. Louis, which is going to have a bigger impact on the Mississippi River? It's the St. Louis one, right? And so by being able to set a pool of money aside and then prioritize throughout the river where are those investments most important, we think that's the most practical way to ensure dollars are going to the highest and best use, rather than have 10 states operating in isolation.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great examples.
So Trevor, I have to ask, since I'm on this end of the river, what do you guys anticipate MRRI's effect to have on the Gulf Coast?
Great question. I want to phone a friend and talk to Matt Rhoda with Healthy Gulf, who's our co-chair of MRRI and some of our other New Orleans and Louisiana area groups to kind of pick their brain. I think a couple of different answers here. One, we do have a fair amount of federal funding, at least in theory, devoted to restoring the Gulf itself. And so we didn't want to try to replicate those programs. They identified the one area where there is a gap, which is we do a lot of dredging to maintain a 9-foot navigation channel. And a lot of that material could be used for island building or to prevent sort of portions of the Gulf Delta from being swallowed up by the sea. And so they've identified that as an area where additional funding would be most appropriate for MRRI. And so I would think of whatever percentage, that's up to the action plan, it's not up to the folks that are pushing for this, of dollars being made available for that purpose would have the most concrete identifiable impact for the Gulf. How much money that is, can't say. Specifically what positive impact or how long we can prolong the health of some of those barrier islands and coastal wetlands, I don't know, because there's this whole other factor in play, which is how quickly we are changing our atmospheric chemistry and bringing sea levels up. And so I guess I would say I'd encourage you to reach out to Matt Rhoda and folks at Healthy Gulf or any of the other partners that are on our endorsement list and kind of get their 2 cents on that.
Yeah, just curious. Thanks.
I'm curious to hear a little more about the kind of equity and justice emphasis of MRRI and whether would that be new for this kind of federal program, or is that something that is part of these other programs in the Chesapeake and the Great Lakes?
Good question. So quick backstory. We started meeting in fall of 2019 around MRRI. And we had begun conversations about some of the EJ related attributes of this work. The pandemic hit, we started meeting remotely, everything was weird, and we finally got back into our flow as a collaborative meeting on a sort of weekly basis via Zoom in May. And then May 28th, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, about a mile from my house, and everything sort of changed somewhat dramatically. And I still have ashes from the 3rd Precinct Police Building in my front yard. I just tilled them into the soil and thought, okay, we'll keep that. That changed our approach somewhat dramatically, and it'd be silly to pretend like it didn't. That we felt like we needed to be much more clear in the legislative language. So there are goals and attributes written into many state and federal geographic programs and initiatives. Prioritizing communities of color, or prioritizing low-income communities, or prioritizing underrepresented communities. And all of that to me doesn't mean anything. Because unless you say the dollars have to go to a certain defined group of individuals or defined group of geographies, the money eventually will stop going to those places, because it tends to be how the levers of power work in governance. And so the difference, from my understanding, between this piece of legislation and its sort of sister geographic programs is we're unique in saying there's a specific percentage of money that has to go to low-income, urban and rural communities and communities of color, and there's a specific sum of money that has to go to a specific, communities that need a certain economic definition. So those are two pieces that I will not lie, we got some pushback about including those, in part because not everyone in DC loves that language, and not everyone looks at that and says, yes, that's the right thing to do. But that's something we pushed really hard on, and the Congresswoman agreed it need to be included. So I'd say that's the major difference, is we're setting a floor for funding. And goals language, neat. That and $3 will get you a cup of coffee, in my opinion.
Thanks.
Well, my dog just got up, looked at me, and walked out. So he thinks our meeting has come to a conclusion.
Is that the sign, like, take me out before your next call? Is it?
I think that's, yeah, I need to go outside before you hop on another one.
Well, I really
Trevor,
appreciate.
this is exciting to see this come together. Thank you for presenting on this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Erin posted some of the relevant links to more information, the language, endorsement, stuff like that in the chat. So please visit those. And if you have, I guess the request for this group would be, if there are organizations you work with or networks that you work with that you think would benefit from hearing about MRRI or would want to engage in the process of shaping it, either legislatively or through the action plan or science plan process, please let us know. We're willing to do, we've got a big collaborative. We got 83 organizations have endorsed it so far. We're all willing to do presentations just like this, really at any time. So please keep the lines of communication open and let us know if there are folks that you feel like would benefit from learning more.
And I'll add to that, the collaborative is still meeting in a consistent way, right? Is it every, so I mean, there's a touch point, where you could, if you can join the collaborative, catch up on the process and the latest in terms of the advocacy, as well as shaping the process, and then kind of just getting to know some of the other partners that have endorsed it in the collaborative space, which doesn't mean you're signing up for a set of tasks, but to be a supportive partner and then see where you plug in as this evolves. So that, there's endorsing and saying you're interested in throwing something out on Twitter, but this is just a nice place where you can at least be on the listserv, join those meetings as you can. And I think they're every other month right now. Is that correct, Trevor?
Right now they're monthly.
Okay.
And I put the list of current endorsees in the chat. That's also available on the endorsement link itself. But yeah, right now we're meeting monthly from 12:30 to 1:30. I want to say it's whatever next Wednesday is. So let's call it the second Wednesday of the month.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got weekly campaign team meetings and monthly steering committee meetings. So there's plenty of opportunities to engage and get involved.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for joining. Please don't forget to visit Regain, and hopefully we'll see you next month.